Call the meeting order. Could you please rise for the pledge? Bruce, could you lead us, please?
Thank you, sir. Would you please, I pledge allegiance
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. You want to take a roll, please?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Director Zimmer.
Present.
Director Garfinkel. Director Gibson.
here.
And Chairperson Ohelski.
Present. I don't have my agenda. Next thing, the minutes.
Yeah. I don't have an agenda. I have a packet.
If you like, I can flash the agenda up on the screen.
Thank you. We have the packages. We just don't have the agenda. Whoa.
Actually, we have some in the back as well, perhaps. The first item is director comments, Mr. Chair.
Right. Thank you. Do we have any additional comments at this point in time?
No,
Nope.
none for me.
Nope. Bill? Bruce? Okay.
And then our consent calendar, sir.
Right. Okay, so we have the consent calendar, which is the approval of the minutes, first of all, and the warrants, budget, et cetera. Does anybody have any questions before we go to public comment?
No.
Okay, so we'll go to public comment on the consent agenda, which is the minutes from our last meeting and the approval of warrants, budget update, and invoice register.
Question, is this where we
Yeah.
talk about the library well?
Not
No.
yet. It's coming.
Let us know what it is, will you?
Got it.
Any comments on this? Okay, seeing none, we'll close public comment and bring it back.
Move approval of consent.
Okay, we have a second?
Second that?
Okay, we have a motion and a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, because you weren't here last meeting. Okay, then we'll move on to the next item, which is the executive director's report.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is going to be the briefest report yet because I wanted to leave plenty of time for our other agenda items. So just a brief update on tomorrow night. We're going to have a little informal conservation symposium here. It's not a formal meeting of this board or this committee, but the staff of our various entities will be handling the event, and we're going to have some presentations about the status of conservation and available rebates in the community. We're going to talk about specific technologies and give some, I think, very good quality information on some of the indoor technology rebates that are available. And then we're going to have some booths or tables where folks can come and speak to county staff. There'll be a stack of rebate forms there, which we hope to fill out and talk to Golden State about their rebates for folks who might be outside of the sewer area, and also have county planning here for Title 19 questions. So hope it's going to be a good evening, and it's 7 p.m. here in this room tomorrow night.
Yeah, and a mailer went out. I know we got a mailer.
Did
so
you get it?
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, and I have one other quick item of note that I think is of interest, and that is the state, and I think I see Carolyn Berg here, recently had a change in classification for our groundwater basin. I thought it would be helpful to have Carolyn just give a little update. It was a surprise how they handled it, and just briefly, Carolyn, if you could.
Great. Carolyn Berg with the County of San Luis Obispo. So, yeah, a quick update. The Department of Water Resources released its reprioritization of all of the basins throughout the state based on the modifications they made back in 2016. So they used largely the same analysis, but they added in one new factor. So in the past, they were looking at population overlying basins, the anticipated growth in a basin, how many wells rely on groundwater, that sort of thing. But they added in a new factor that was any other information DWR deemed important, which it turns out they were listening to us, and so they added in an actual recognition of adjudications that are listed as being exempt from the new Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. So anyways, that boils down to they have a draft recommendation that this basin, of course, is largely exempt from SGMA, but for the fringe areas outside of your BMC's boundary, that those should be very low priority and not subject to SGMA at this time. The challenge is we've been pursuing boundary modifications to create a sub-basin for the Warden Creek area outside of essentially the Los Osos Basin, and they're on the same timeline. So the state won't finalize the recommendations for the reprioritization until October, and they also won't finalize any boundary modification request until October. And so we're still planning to submit our boundary request to create 2 sub-basins and work with the state to see if hopefully that doesn't impact this new prioritization. So we'll be working closely with the state throughout that process. But still worth noting, they'll allow comments from any individuals or agencies through July 18th, and more information can be found on the Department of Water Resources Basin Boundary Modification page.
Thanks, Carol.
Second.
Before you sit down, Carol, let's see if we have any questions, please. Anybody have any questions? I think Mark did.
Just for clarification, you said it was going to be October before we heard back from them?
That's when they'll finalize. So
They'll
this summer they're doing public comment periods on the draft prioritization, which is important because they may get comments from other state agencies or local agencies that are contesting that new factor they added in to consider adjudications, and they may question other pieces of analysis.
Okay.
But yeah, that'll happen this summer. Then the state will take into consideration any comments and finalize. They said October, but any time in the fall, I suppose.
Okay, great. Then it'd just be good to have updates if they become available as
Yeah.
the process moves along.
We're happy to do that.
Yeah.
for-
Yeah, staff will do that.
Thank you, Carolyn.
Great, thanks.
Okay. No other questions, Bill? Bruce? Okay. All right, thank you.
That's all that staff has for today, and I know probably public comment just on this item.
Does anybody have any public comment on that item? Okay, seeing none, we'll move on to, we have the Basin Management Plan.
The annual report, sir,
Yes,
is the next
annual
on the
report,
agenda.
yes.
Thank you. At your last meeting, you did consider a draft of the 2017 annual report, and we want to thank the various staff people from the membership here for giving detailed comments to our consultants. We've been through those and have made changes to the report, and I think it's a better report for the comments that were received. Today, we would like to, if possible, have the adoption of that report so we can submit it to the court in a timely fashion. We try to do that by the end of June each year. So if there are, I would say, minor comments like we did last year that aren't substantive, feel free to pass those along to staff. If they're editorial in nature, we'll make those before we upload the report to DWR's site and submit it to the court. If there are more substantive things that you want to talk about that require revisions, we're going to ask that you set a special meeting date, perhaps as early as next week. We'll look at dates, and if we have to, we'll have it at the CSD office. But it depends on your feedback on the report. Staff wanted to make a quick presentation of one of the monitoring tools that we're adding to this year's report. It was contemplated in adaptive management last year as a way of looking at our upper aquifer. And I have just a few slides here on the screen that I'm going to direct you to. And I'll just talk through these briefly. So last year we talked about coming up with some sort of a metric or measurement for looking at the upper aquifer. Obviously, we're producing substantially more from that zone now than we were in previous years. And that's only going to increase as we complete all of Program A, including the district's 8th Street well, which will be coming on prior to your next annual report. So the thought was, as we increase production, we need to keep a close eye on the upper aquifer, even though there's, of course, no evidence of seawater intrusion in that aquifer. We need to make sure that we're keeping safe water levels to keep any potential seawater at bay. And so the thought was an upper aquifer metric of some type. We did look at a couple of different options here, and we worked pretty closely with Golden State's hydrogeologic experts in coming up with a tool that took into account not just what happens over time, but what happens over the bay frontage. And we thought we came up with a tool that would be very helpful for the upper aquifer, and here it is. So it's a little hard to see at distance, but there's a number of upper aquifer and first water wells, 5 wells that are along the bay fringe where seawater intrusion would be of concern. One of those is our proposed Cuesta by the Sea monitoring well there in orange. So we do hope to fill in that gap at some point, but the others exist. So we thought about taking these wells and coming up with some sort of an index or metric that we could plot over time. But the thought was that was not descriptive enough of that bay frontage, and so we came up with, I think, a pretty creative tool, and I'll give Toby Moore with Golden State credit for this because he's using this in another area that has sort of a seawater boundary. And that is a water level profile. And the way that this tool works is we basically plot there in red, the bottom line is what we'd call the protective elevation. And that's the groundwater elevation where theoretically, because of the pressure of the fresh water, seawater would have no chance to come into the basin in our upper aquifer. And then we plot a smooth curve of actual water levels through this network of monitoring wells. Of course, we hope to fill in the Cuesta monitoring well and make sure in all points we're above that protective level. So that doesn't mean that if you dip below that in certain areas that you'll have seawater intrusion. It means your confidence is high that if you stay above it, you won't have a potential for seawater intrusion. So we thought that the spatial character of this was better than just a linear metric. And someday we might actually add something like this to the lower aquifer. We liked it so much. You'll also notice that in some of the areas that are labeled marsh, areas like the Sweet Springs area, you actually have the pressure of some of this water poking up through the ground and discharging to atmosphere. So in our basin model, we do account for the fact that some of this water simply flows out and keeps some of our fringe wetlands under fresh water. So we've built this into the annual report as a first year, and as this line changes, we can plot it over time like we do the seawater front. But I want to thank the various staffs for coming up with a creative tool, and I think this will do a nice job monitoring the upper aquifer for our annual reports. Other than that, the latest final draft, we're calling it, has the executive summary and the adaptive management chapter all prepared and ready to go. And staff is prepared to have you take action on the report today if you're willing to do that. Be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Do we have any questions before we go to public comment? Bill?
I'm not sure that this is terribly important on the report, but you have S&T listed as using 30 acre feet of producing a production of 30 acre feet for 2017. That's actually should be 32 acre feet.
Thank you for that edit, and if you could send us your data on that, we'll make sure we catch that in the final.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Anything? Okay, we'll go to public comment. This is not the Andre well. This is our annual report. So anybody have any comments on the annual report? I know it was discussed last meeting. Okay, seeing none, we'll bring it back then. I think I'm ready to move forward with it at this point, but what do you guys think?
Mike.
I was going to make one comment after the public comment just about the growth management and the county's work on that. We discussed that at a previous meeting Will that come back to this committee to have a final review of that before it's finalized?
Sure. Well, I mean, in terms of going forward as we work on our community plan.
Right.
So the community plan in process, we hope, I don't know if planning is here, but we hope to be in front of our planning commission later this year, if not late this year. That charts the development potential looking forward, and a big piece of that, of course, is going to be the water supply.
Right.
Do we have a sustainable water supply secure to serve the new development that's envisioned in the build out of the community under the community plan. So as that community plan goes through its hearing process, first the Planning Commission and then the board will certainly bring that back. Assuming that it is approved, and it will be, I hope, within the next year, and that involves going through the Coastal Commission process as well, which can be considerably challenging. But then the county has to decide at what rate of growth are we going to proceed, and I think that is going to be deeply entwined in especially the Coastal Commission's understanding of our basin management plan, is that, and that ties into adaptive management. So you can see that if we can demonstrate to them a sustainable water supply, we then have to verify as growth proceeds that we are still meeting the objectives of the basin plan. And so all of those things absolutely will come back. The other issue, getting ready for the community plan hearings, it's high on my list to actually make outreach to Coastal Commission staff to brief them on the Basin Management Committee's considerable activities. Because that is I don't know that there's another coastal groundwater basin in the state that is managed with more sophistication than ours is. And I think it's going to take coastal staff a little bit of a study session to get up to speed on it. And so in order to make the community plan process successful, that's on my list. So we'll be giving you updates on how that goes as well.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Okay. Mr. Chair, I have one other quick note. The principal author of the report reminded me that in the footnote of the production table, all figures are rounded to the nearest 10 acre feet. So that's why your 32 showed up as 30.
Thank you for the answer to that question.
Thank you, Spencer.
Now we know why he's here.
Yeah.
Okay, so what you guys want to do?
I want to move approval of the annual report and to transmit it as necessary where it needs to go.
I'll second that.
Okay, so we have a motion and a second. Any more discussion? Okay, all in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Okay, unanimously. So you're ready to go, Rob.
We are. And thank you, Spencer, for your work on that.
Okay, so now that brings us to the Program C well site selection process, which that's why I think everybody's here. So, Rob, we'll turn it over to you to have you give your presentation.
Thank you very much, and do want to thank everybody for coming. And as more folks come in, we'll bring in some more chairs. I did want to walk through a presentation. I'm sorry if it's going to feel maybe a little bit long. We think this was significant enough that we shortened our agenda and made sure we have enough time to both talk through this and to listen to public comment. So I wanted to talk a little bit about process first. The discussion that we're having today is intended to be primarily technical in nature. So I'm not going to be coming forward with a site recommendation, with a final conclusion, anything like that. What I wanted to do is to get out in the open the alternative sites that we're looking at this time, and also the factors that we're considering as we look at those sites. And I'll make a few statements as to the relative pro and con of each factor at each site, but this is intended to get information in your hands and give you an opportunity to provide some feedback long before we get into environmental review and final site selection. So this is really the first time that this process has been talked about in public. So thank you for being here at the opening meeting, I guess you could say. The format of this meeting can be frustrating. and I apologize for that. It is for me too. I prefer open dialogue, and I'm always willing to have meetings out there in your homes or whatever you need to do. I've done that once. Or if folks have individual questions and want to meet in groups and have dialogue, I'm more than happy to do that. This format is a little more stoic. So at the end of my presentation, the directors here will talk and ask questions, and after they're done, there'll be an opportunity for public comment where everyone has 3 minutes, which is I know it can be annoying because you might have more to say. And then I take copious notes as you're asking questions and then answer them all at the end. So because of the constraints of that method, the CSD, who is the current lead on this proposed well, is planning to hold a workshop, we think, in July. And that will be a more open format where you can have a little back and forth, kind of more question and answer type format, more roundtable discussion. But again, I'm happy to do that in small groups if folks want to organize and that's important to you. Whatever we do, we are going to go through an environmental review process and carry forward alternatives. We think on a project like this that has some controversy on it, not just the Andre site, but others as well, that when we get into environmental review, we hold all those alternatives on the table, talk about all the impacts, really vet this thing in the public before we get to a point where we're ready to recommend a final site. And it's only after environmental review that any board here can consider a final purchase of a property. So you're not going to see, a pre-purchase of a specific site followed by environmental review. The review will come first. And then after that, you walk through the formal coastal permit process that gets vetted with the county at that level, and then ultimately, if it's appealed, goes all the way to the Coastal Commission. So it's a process ahead of us, and we appreciate you hanging with us in it.
And Rob,
Sure, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt, but I think it might be useful to outline in a little more detail the relationship of the individual agencies that are here at the Basin Management Committee and the agencies, that different roles and responsibilities those agencies are going to have. In particular, this is a project being contemplated by the Los Osos Community Services District. The coastal development permitting is a county function, and the Basin Management Committee is more advisory than anything else. I don't know what else you might want to add on that, but what our role is in this room as opposed to other boards that are going to meet to consider this.
Excellent. I think that's good. This committee has the broad responsibility of ensuring the implementation of the Basin Plan. And one of those Basin Plan projects, actually a key project, is the construction of what we call Program C wells. And so even though the specific project is being pursued by the Los Osos Community Services District, which Marshall represents, we will have the rest of the committee interested in this project moving forward because it's integral to balancing our groundwater basin. Thank you for that, Bruce. Also, Golden State may ultimately receive some water from this. There may be an arrangement with Golden State and the district depending on where this well actually ends up. So the final ownership and management of the well won't be clarified until the site is selected and we get a little further down the road. And ultimately, all of the purveyors represented here have the ability to move water around and to share resources within the basin. But from a permit perspective, the county will be that lead agency in providing a coastal development permit unless it's appealed to the Coastal Commission.
Right, and just some additional background. The Los Osos CSD, we've taken the lead on this, but this is part of the Basin Management Plan, which was approved by the court.
Yeah.
So it's something that has to be done. It's just that we're taking the lead on it, but the Basin Management Plan requires this.
Yeah, very good.
And if I could add to the overarching concept of the Basin Management Plan and the demands placed on this committee by the court is to balance the water supply in this basin so that all users of water over this groundwater basin have a sustainable groundwater supply. So that includes everybody. And so it takes a little bit of time to go through the technical details of why Program C has spotted a well somewhere in the general area that you're going to talk about. But again, the ultimate goal is for that well to replace other production and, again, for everybody who draws water from this basin, create a sustainable water supply. The one other thought I might have is we might, since we have folks that I haven't seen here before, we might introduce ourselves along the table just to be sure. We don't have cards in front of us. I'm Bruce Gibson. I'm the 2nd District County Supervisor representing Los Osos, County of San Luis Obispo.
I'm Mark Zimmer, General Manager for the Coastal District for Golden State Water Company.
I'm Bill Garfinkel. I'm president of S&T Mutual Water Company.
Marshall Ohilsky, I'm the chair of the Basin Management Committee and the vice president of Los Osos CSD. So,
And I'm Rob Miller, the interim executive director and the district engineer for the CSD.
we got to get rid of that interim title because it's.
I'm keeping that out there. We'll see how this goes. All right. So one of the things we wanted to be clear on is that we don't want to be in a situation, and maybe there's even some owners here, where we put a property up on the screen and presume that the owner is a willing seller. So any site that I mention here, I want to be clear up front that there is no agreement with any given seller, and the discussions with any given seller may be non-existent or in its infancy. So don't assume because you see a site here that site is necessarily for sale. I think it's important. And also that other sites may be identified and pursued. So this is not an exhaustive list. In fact, I've already received some input from folks who live out in the Andre Avenue area of sites that we might want to consider. And so this is not an exhaustive list. It's just those that we have maybe a more detailed understanding about right now. And the factors and criteria that I talked about, again, there may be others that come to light at some point. Mr. Chair?
Yeah, Rob, I just wanted to add something back from the previous slide, but just for everybody's understanding, under CEQA, which is the Environmental Quality Control Act the Environmental Act under state law, alternatives have to be studied. It's not they have to be studied. So you can't just study one site. You have to have alternatives under the law. So,
thank you, Mr. Chair. So this is a graphic that shows, for our discussion today, the 4 sites that are, again, understood in a higher level of detail and are being considered going forward. So Site A, and I'll show you sort of an aerial image of each of these, is down off of the extension of Pismo along the soccer fields, Los Osos Middle School. Site B is on private property off of Sage Avenue, which you access off into Pomo Avenue. Site C is on Andre Avenue. Most of you in the room are probably aware of that site. And then Site D would be a vacant area to the south of Sunny Oaks Mobile Home Park. So those are our 4 sites for discussion today. A little more detail here on location. And I'll be posting this presentation to our website after today, so you'll have a chance to download that and study it in more detail. So as you can see from Site A there, it's right there by the track. That can be moved around flexibly anywhere around, either in the right-of-way or on school property. And so that would be our Site A. Site B, you can see there on a vacant piece of rural residential ground on a fairly large residential property. They have some open land that's being considered for Site B. Site C is on a 1-acre developed piece of property on Andre Avenue. There's actually an existing house and garage area, and this site would occupy a portion of an existing structure. We'd actually remove the structure, drill the well, and put the structure back over the well. And then if you've driven Sunny Oaks Mobile Home Park, you'll know that they have a small piece of open ground on their southerly boundary, which could be available for future expansion of the mobile home park, and we're calling that our Site D, though there may be other sites near the frontage along the Los Osos Valley Road corridor that could be considered part of Sunny Oaks Mobile Home Park. That's the same mobile home park where a sewer lift station now exists, and you drive by it as you drive by Los Osos Valley Road. So we're going to be using some technical vernacular here, and forgive me for that, but we'll be using this consistently throughout this whole process. And so it's probably, if you're wanting to follow along, good to get up to speed on it. Our groundwater basin has a number of different aquifer zones that we continuously refer to. And in general, it's broken up into an upper aquifer or shallower aquifer and a lower aquifer. There are some very, very shallow zones that we don't necessarily use for production wells, but we call those zones A and B. You won't hear about those much in these discussions. What you will hear a lot about is our zones C, D, and E. Zone C, which is shown there in the pale blue, is what we call our upper aquifer, and that is the zone that most of the private domestic wells tap. And you'll see in that little yellow half circle called alluvium, that's Los Osos Creek. And you'll see that zone C, or upper aquifer, sort of gets thinner as you go towards the creek. So right beneath that upper aquifer is a nice thick clay layer that separates the upper aquifer from the lower aquifer. And that separation does allow some leakage over time. It's one of the ways we get water down into our lower aquifer, is water physically leaking through that thick clay very, very slowly. But we can tell through the water chemistry that does occur. And then we have two zones that are associated with our lower aquifer. We call those zones D and E, both lower aquifer zones separated by a clay. And I'm going to stop for a drink here. So when we're talking about these wells, we'll often say, well, this well is going to be a zone D and E well. And that means it will be focused on those lower aquifer zones that lie below that clay that separates zone C and zone D. So you might be asking yourself, well, how good is that clay to really separate out these wells? And if you study the annual report that we just approved, you could see that the water levels and water chemistry are very different in zone C compared to zone D. And you could pump a zone D well quite close to a zone C well, and sometimes you'll see a small effect, and sometimes you'll see very little effect, if at all. So that's one of the things we'll be looking for moving forward. So there's your primer on Los Osos groundwater basin zones. We did sort of a custom, what we call a geologic cross-section, and this is posted on the web as part of our staff report if you want to look at it more carefully. But we actually took a cross-section through these 4 well sites so we could compare them and contrast them. And I'm going to show a quick figure here so you can see for these 4 sites how they relate to these aquifer zones that I just mentioned. So you'll see them listed from left to right. Again, Site A is the middle school. Site B is the north end of Sage Avenue. Site C is the Andre site. And Site D is Sunny Oaks Mobile Home Park. And so you'll see that all 4 of these sites really could, if you drilled a well, tap zones C, D, or E. All the sites could do that. Although in Site A on the left side, you see that the aquifer gets quite thin as it goes to the north. And so Site A, you're going to hear a little bit later, we are concerned that the production may not be great there because the aquifer zones are not very thick, and you have very little of Zone E available. You see it just clips the edge of it. Site B, the Sage Avenue site, could certainly tap all 3 aquifer zones, though in that site I'm going to describe later, we would not tap Zone C for fear of impacting private domestic wells in that vicinity. Site C, the Andre site, you can see it, the basin's deeper in that location, and you have quite a thick layer of aquifer available in Zone E on Site C. And then Site D, the Sunny Oaks Mobile Home Park, again, all 3 aquifers would be available at that site. So I think this is a helpful way to understand when we're talking about expected production from any given well. And I'll say this because if I don't, our groundwater hydrologist in the room will probably remind me, and that is you do not know how a well will perform until you actually drill a test hole. No amount of modeling is going to answer that question, because not only is it how deep can you drill and still hit the right zones, but what are the soils like in that specific location where you drilled. I had one that I did just a few months ago that we drilled in a great spot and found lots of water, but the soils were so tight in that location, the water could not get into the well and give us the production that we needed. So there's no guarantees on any of these sites until you drill a test hole and actually test it that you'll have a well that meets your criteria. So now we want to get into some of the factors that will go in to selecting a site. Again, this is not an exhaustive list, but I wanted to give you an opportunity to think through the same thoughts that staff is working through right now. And as we look at these 4 sites, the things that come to mind when we consider them. And these will be a little bit qualitative. We won't have a lot of numbers here. As we get into environmental review, there's going to be more and more numerical information, more and more things like weighting factors and ranking factors, those things that lead to a site selection. But for this meeting, we want to be very clear on the technical basis and the factors that are being looked at, if that makes sense. So in Site A at the middle school, when we talk about annual production, we basically mean how much water the well can produce in the period of a year. We're looking for at least 100 acre-feet and really would prefer 150 to 200 acre-feet or more from one of these wells. But 100 would be, I would say, the floor as to having it be worth putting in the investment for a pipeline and all the permitting. We wouldn't want to go below that. So in Site A at the middle school, production is a key concern, and we wouldn't really know what that would be until we drilled a test hole. The site has certainly other advantages that we'll talk about, but production is a concern there to get at least 100 acre-feet. The Sage site, Site B, we're going to call that neutral. It looks like production would be acceptable, pretty good site. Not super strong because you are pretty far to the north. Site C, the Andre site, is in the deepest portion of the lower aquifer. We call production potential an advantage of this site. Again, it's not the only factor to be considered, but certainly production is important. And so that would be an advantage of Site C. And a similar advantage in Site D. In fact, unlike the other 3 sites, Site D is removed sufficiently from the other private domestic wells that we think we could even have some production from Zone C, the upper aquifer at Sunny Oaks, if we chose to do that. So whereas sites A, B, and C would all be deep wells, deep aquifer, to avoid impacts to the surrounding private domestic wells, Sunny Oaks could be screened in all 3 zones and may ultimately be the best producer because of that. So the nuts and bolts of connecting these wells to our existing infrastructure is very important because of cost. And so we look at proximity to community water mains as being an important factor. So at the middle school, we do need quite a bit of pipeline there, about 1,100 feet. I'd say that's a modest investment in infrastructure and neutral in terms of being a pro or a con. The Sage site is a long pipeline down Sage Avenue. We have a crossing of South Bay Boulevard there. So that one's going to be a tricky pipeline, certainly viable. It's just long, and we'd call that a disadvantage of that site. The Andre property, if we worked cooperatively with Golden State, that's not to imply there's any existing arrangement. There's not. But it does appear that there are pipelines sized for fire flow that are fairly close to that well. So if there was an arrangement made, ultimately, it's pretty close to existing infrastructure. And then Sunny Oaks, it's about 1,200 feet, similar to Site A. We do know that they recently paved their streets, which look great, and so they're not interested in any open trench, I'm sure, and so we'd have to do that using trenchless boring technology if we were to do it. So we called that one neutral on infrastructure as well. Neighborhood and community acceptance. That's an interesting factor that actually all of your heads just turned a little more when I said that. The Los Osos Middle School, you can't really make this statement in Los Osos, so I'm going to say it anyways, but expected to be non-controversial. And that would certainly be an advantage. And I've heard that from a number of different angles, both from the perspective of some of the decision makers and also from community members who have approached me with this. Why don't you just drill it at the middle school? And of course, that you have to weigh that against the potential for not getting enough water at that location. But that expected to be non-controversial. The Sage site, I'd say potentially controversial. There are some neighbors there who have expressed concerns, primarily over impacts to their existing wells. We actually did some testing at that well because there is a lower aquifer well to test and prepared a short report. And so that one is potentially controversial as it moves through the process. Site C, the Andre site, I'm going to say significant community concern for that site. We've definitely heard that both in writing and in verbal communication, and we'd call that a disadvantage of that site, that we have folks who perhaps even with all of the description I'm going to give you today, which is intended to let you know that any site has to be fully vetted and mitigated, remains controversial and therefore would be, on this factor, a disadvantage. And then Sunny Oaks, I'd say we don't have a good read on opinion at this time. It's certainly a developed neighborhood. We'd have to, like any of these sites, they'd have to be sensitively done, but we don't know how Sunny Oaks would perceive, what the residential folks there would perceive a new well on their southern edge. Seller status and land cost. This is not known until you get to a final arrangement, which would be after environmental review. But what we do know today is Los Osos Middle School, either publicly owned via the county or owned by the school, certainly an advantage. It's very likely we could come to a cost-effective arrangement on a well site there. Again, if it were worth drilling, which it may not be. Sage, I say, is unknown and perhaps premature. There's been no final evaluation of that cost. Andre, we'd call it an advantage. We do have a willing seller there, and at least a ballpark cost, which would be in the range of what we've budgeted. So we'd call that an advantage in that factor. And then Sunny Oaks, again, unknown, perhaps premature. We do know if there are the potential for new mobile home units in the same location, the owner is going to be concerned about that loss of revenue and would want to be compensated for that. But again, there may be other locations near their frontage that are not so costly, but it's premature to make a call on that location. Aesthetic concerns, noise, visual, or other concerns, some of which you certainly are going to be free to express here after I'm done with my presentation. All of these wells we would look to do with a submerged, submersible-style pump in a soundproof enclosure of some kind, so that would be sensitive to the community at any site. And certainly where we're adjacent to any residential uses, that would be even more important. Site A, not in a residential neighborhood, and while it might still be a submersible well, we don't expect people to be concerned about that to the level that they are at the other sites. Sage is on a fairly large residential parcel. Some of the visual issues are maybe not so sensitive, but certainly sound attenuation will be very important there. The Andre site is the only place where we're considering a well on a 1 acre piece of property, and that would receive, say, the maximum level of mitigation. Everything needs to be fully enclosed and sound attenuated and carefully done to be in character with the residential neighborhood. And I understand there are some here that may indicate that that's not possible in their minds, but that would be the approach. And then Sunny Oaks, adjacent to residential uses, again, requiring full attenuation. The visual aspects of a well, we thought it'd be important to just have a couple careful slides selected from pictures. If you haven't been to a well that's open to the air, here's an example of what it looks like. essentially a block of concrete with access to the well sticking up from that, and then some piping to convey the water and special valving, and then there's a control box that goes along with that. So there really isn't, when a well doesn't require treatment, and it won't be known until the well is drilled, and we're certainly hoping that these wells don't require treatment, that the well's fairly simple. There's not a lot to it. It's a hole in the ground with concrete and some piping attached to it and controls, but this is what it looks like when it's outside. When you use a well site for other public works uses, you can sometimes get a look like this, which is the District South Bay site. And this is a location where that property is being used for some storage of materials. There's treatment that occurs on the property, some lay-down space for the wastewater project. When that was done, there's a lot going on, and this is in public right-of-way at this site. So this is an example of a well site that's really also serving as a corporation yard or a lay-down yard, and is also used for standby power for the sewer project. Lots of uses here, and none of the well sites that we're talking about would look anything like this, nor would we be proposing standby power. So it would be not this complicated arrangement. It would be this simple arrangement inside a building. And similar, if you drive out after the meeting and look at the library here, this really doesn't show too well, but you'll see the little boxy green enclosure in the parking lot. That's the district's Palisades well, and would be similar to what an enclosed well looks like, although that one's a much larger motor, much larger installation than what's being proposed at any of these four sites. But it'd be an example of what it looks like when you put a well in a building. So this is a very important slide to talk about, because it's been communicated to us that this is the number one factor that folks are concerned about. They want to know, is there going to be interference with the surrounding wells when this well is pumped and 100 to 200 acre feet are produced from it? What will the effects be? In Site A, we expect this to be an advantage. There are no other residential wells in the vicinity. We don't expect there to be measurable pumping interference. You don't know until you test it, but that's what we expect. In Site B, we actually did test it because there was an existing lower zone well that had not been pumped in many years. We got it up and running and pumped it, and we measured what the results were in the surrounding domestic wells, and we know that that impact was minor in that location, and as you got farther and farther away from the well, it became more and more negligible. On the Andre site, we don't know until it's modeled and tested. We've not done that work yet. We expect that if you have a shallow well in that zone, and I mean as a program or a Zone C well, that the impacts will be minor. I did want to make a couple of comments and pause there for a second, because most of the people here are concerned specifically about that site. And one is that we don't necessarily have records of every well that's been drilled over the last few years. We have some very good records stretching back over time, but I do understand that some folks have drilled. Some of those wells are deeper. And so during environmental review, we will go and get from Health Department and do a record search and look for wells that might be tapping into some of the lower zones there and identify what those impacts might be. I also wanted to note, and those of you who have talked to me in the past, and some of you have, that the environmental document, when it's done for any of these sites, I think will have specific mitigations, that impacts are noted that were either not foreseen or not modeled, that those impacts have to be mitigated. And what that means will be defined during that process. It may mean anything from assuring water supply to drilling other wells or providing water. I can't prejudge what the district will do with that, but I can say I've seen a number of different environmental documents that required monitoring and mitigation when there's neighboring wells that may be impacted. And then, and that's for Site C primarily. In Site D at Sunny Oaks, again, we see this issue as an advantage because we don't have a lot of surrounding residential wells in that vicinity. So sites A and D, I think this issue would be much more straightforward than sites B and C, where it'll be a challenge, but one that can be addressed through environmental review and through mitigation. When we talk about environmental impacts and endangered species, most of you know that here in Los Osos we have the more shoulder band dune snail and associated habitat and endangered species, and that essentially almost all vacant ground here in Los Osos throughout the community is potential habitat. And we do know that that's true on some of these sites. At the middle school, we will probably be able to put this well in an existing developed area that's already parking or turf or roadway, and we think this is an advantage of that site. There are very few impacts when it comes to endangered species. The Sage site, it's certainly a disadvantage. That site has some challenges in terms of putting a well on vacant property where we know that snails do congregate. That doesn't mean it's impossible. It just means it could be a long process getting it through the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service to actually be able to drill at that location. This is not something the county can approve locally. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has to do it. The Andre site, Site C, we see this as an advantage because we'd be looking to drill only in the developed zone, removing a building and putting it back, essentially. And then in Sunny Oaks, this would be a disadvantage in that it is an undeveloped area of the property, and while they do other activities back there, I think it would still be viewed as undeveloped from the perspective of endangered species. None of these factors really represent a deal breaker other than drilling a test well and not finding enough water. So all of these can be managed over time if you're willing to be patient and consistent. Sort of the more for the engineers among you, some of these sites are much better for long-term access than others. Some of them are tight. The middle school has an advantage. There will be some constraints, but access is very good there. Site B, the Sage site, plenty of access through Sage Avenue, easy to get the drilling rig in and out and to maintain this well. At the Andre site, it's feasible, it's tight. We call that a disadvantage of the site just because it's a narrow driveway that you're negotiating and it's fairly constrained, but again, feasible. And then Sunny Oaks, we'd see this as an advantage, though perhaps tighter than the Sage site. And getting close to wrapping up here. So one of the things we have to consider is how long it might take to get through the coastal development permit process. It's likely that the district may take the lead on environmental review. They have the authority to do that, but only the county can lead the coastal development permit process. At Site A, we see it as, since it's already developed, non-controversial, certainly an advantage of that site if you could find water. Site B, a disadvantage perhaps. We have endangered species issues. We have potential neighborhood issues there. Site C, certainly a disadvantage. We have a lot of neighbor concerns at that site. Might take a long time. We may expect a number of appeals and a long process. And then Site D, Sunny Oaks, perhaps also a disadvantage there because you have habitat, you have potential neighbor concerns. So of the sites that we're fairly sure we're going to have good well production, there's no truly easy sites when it comes to coastal development permitting. All of them, I think, present a potential challenge. I did want to say on this slide, and this is in my staff note, that the basin plan actually contemplates two additional wells. One has already been completed by Golden State Water Company. However, our production requirements here in the community have dropped substantially from what they were in the basin plan, like 20% or even a little bit more. And so it's thought that it's unlikely that we'll need two additional wells to be able to balance the basin with our current population. And so it's likely we'll be selecting one of these, not two of them, though I can't say that with certainty until the study is out that's currently being prepared, which will probably come back in August. So at this point, it looks like it's probably going to be one additional well to balance the basin under current demand. And that is the end of my slide presentation. And so what we're going to do is the committee is going to have a chance to ask questions, and then we'll, after that, invite the public up to come and have 3 minutes apiece. Again, we're going to do a more informal workshop in the future. This one's quite formal because I would usually write down all the answers to your questions and make notes, copious notes while you're talking, and then answer them all at the end. So not very satisfying, I know, but now it's time for the committee.
Well, people can also submit written comments or questions that we'll
Always.
respond to. Yeah. Okay, Mark, did you have a...
Yeah, good presentation. I think you're working through the process, doing, it takes a lot to drill a well these days. One of the things that caught my mind is and I think you did touch on it a little bit, but just the operations and maintenance of a well today. Having the small footprint for actually the well is one consideration, but over time that well will need to be maintained in a certain way, and that might require equipment coming in, things like that. And just the water quality data, really, if you could, I don't know how much work has gone into it, analyzing that, or how much information you have available to analyze, but trying to project the future treatment is just a huge component today. Our regulations get more stringent, and it seems like the wells that Golden State operates, many of them, we're adding treatment to those just to comply with the regulations. So I think those are key considerations as you're working through the process. But overall, just want to make a comment. I think you did a really good review of many of the what it takes to drill a well, and a lot goes into it. And so we'll look forward to assisting with this project as it moves forward.
Yes, sir.
Bill, before we go to public comment, do you have any questions or comments?
No question. Comment is, I thought it was tremendous in that presentation you just made, Rob. Answered a couple of the questions that I was going to bring up, so that's about it.
Okay, thanks. Bruce?
Yeah, just a comment, and I think the public can take a certain amount of comfort, great amount of comfort, from the thoroughness that Rob has walked through all the different issues here. So I just want you to know there's a lot of process ahead here. And we refer to environmental review. This is the California Environmental Quality Act, or CEQA. That's the state statute that requires the preparation, in certain circumstances, of an environmental impact report, or EIR. That's a very intense informational process, and it's there for a reason, and that's to provide whatever decision makers have to consider this kind of project with all the information they need. There's a whole formal process of that, which allows folks to comment on what they think needs to be studied, and with that, then all of that comes together in a permit application to the county, where the county has to consider how this affects everybody. And I just want to go back to the idea that the reason this well is being considered is to balance the Los Osos groundwater basin for everybody. And that includes folks who are close to the well and folks who are not so close to the well. So we certainly look forward to your comments. I'm, in the course of time, as your county supervisor, certainly available to chat with you as well. And I know I have talked to some folks on the Andre Avenue. We in the Basin Management Committee work cooperatively with our communities to really solve a problem. That's what we're here for. So, again, look forward to your comments. Thank Rob for his outlining of what we need to know, and we'll look forward to moving forward on this. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, and I would just repeat the comment I made before, which was under CEQA, alternatives have to be studied. You can't just study one single site. So we do have to look at alternative locations, which is a good thing in the process, because that, as Rob went through here, it lays out the disadvantages and advantages for the various sites. So, okay, so we'll have public comment now. If you'd step up to the microphone and please state your name for the record. And this
My name is Max Sitcher. My wife and I live at 1616 Napomo, north side of the street, halfway between Andre and Willow. Our well is a county test well, has been for 15 or 20 years. It's currently down approximately 10 feet. at 79-foot level. However, I have two questions. Number one, if this well why is this well needed? Is it to supply water to the golf course area? If so, why can't they drill into the lower aquifer at that location? And my second question, more curiosity than anything else, since we do draw water from the upper aquifer, is if a well goes into the lower aquifer, how does it affect the upper aquifer?
Thank you. And as Rob mentioned, he'll be responding to all the comments or questions at the end.
Perfect, I do. Thank you.
My name's Ed Van Fleet. I've lived at 1673 Napomo Avenue for 30 years. Rob, I have a few questions and comments regarding your letter dated this date addressed to the Los Osos Basin Management Committee. You write, I'm a little confused on this part, but you've answered it a little bit. Program C consists of 3 wells located on the eastern side of the central area. You call these expansion wells 1, 2, and 3. Then on page 2, you write 4 alternative sites have been identified. Those are the ones you just went over: Los Osos Middle School, Sage, Andre, and Sunny Oaks. The question is, are we talking 3 sites, 4 sites, or 7 sites? Again, on page 2, you write that the Andre well is proposed to be 600 feet deep. My well's 80 feet. Is that true, that it's going to be 600 feet? Also, you write there's a 10% set aside. Who or what is this 10% set aside for? On page 4 are the key factors for site selection, neighborhood acceptance. I think you can figure on pretty much 0 on that. Noise operations and construction impacts. Nobody in the neighborhood's happy about that one either. And in fact, that one violates our CC&Rs, which says, number 1, land use and building type. No lot shall be used except for residential and small farms purposes. Number 4 on our CC&Rs says nuisances. No noxious or offensive activity shall be carried on any lot, nor shall anything be done there which may become an annoyance or nuisance to the neighborhood. And on environmental impacts, you state that maybe it's less on a undeveloped property, or actually it's more on a developed property. We have, on my property, I have 20 mature native oak trees. My neighbors around me have that many or even more. If you drive through our neighborhood, you'll see how many oak trees. If you drop the water table, there's a good chance you'll destroy every native oak tree in our neighborhood. The other one is potential interference with adjacent private wells. Now, you use the word potential there. That concerns me. And it goes on to say zone D and E are expected. Again, that phrase concerns me. Have minimal impacts on existing zone C wells. Since you've used 2 qualifiers in one sentence, please tell us what potentially could go wrong. Last question. I have it on good authority that tenants are going to be moving into 2030 Andre the first of the month, and they've been told to expect a new well to be drilled on the property. My question is, has this already been decided, and are we wasting our time here? One final point. I don't know
you
if
have to wrap it up.
One final point for you guys. No water pipelines are in the north end of Andre or Willow, and no water pipelines are at all on the Pomo, Sage, Hollister, or Freeman.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, gentlemen, committee members, Supervisor Gibson. Mr. Miller, I really appreciate the work that you put into this. It did a lot. It does make me feel a little comfortable. However, we moved in our property in 1985. 5 years later, we had to replace our 120-foot well with a 220-foot well. Within the last year, 3 of my neighbors also had to replace their wells due to falling water tables. So I have a big concern over the water table right now dropping. I'd love to live in my house for another 15 to 20 years. I don't know if I'd be able to if without that well. So I also have a question, is what water source recharges these aquifers? So if it's the same for all of all the zones, what's going to happen if we draw water from the lower zones? Will the upper zones get less water recharged? Thank you very much.
Thank you. You can pull it down.
Sorry. Hi, my name's Brenda Hawk. Okay? Better?
Yep.
My name's Brenda Hawk. I live at 2073 Buckskin Drive. We are a customer of Golden State Water, but we're part of a neighborhood, and we bought in to this property in 2006 at the end of a street where there's 67 acres of open field, and we inquired very carefully as to what the development plans were for that area. I feel, number one, when the sewer was put in, 4 houses on our street were burglarized because of the traffic of non-residents that had access to the neighborhood. Many of my neighbors are elderly people that I think would be impacted both by the increase in traffic and by the disturbance of the land. I came in late, so I don't have the handout, and this may have already been addressed, but I came in when you were showing the slide of a willing seller on Andre. I see this developer as not a willing seller. He bought the property with the intention of bartering the property to allow him to retain 10% of the production so that he could do further development for profit in another part of Los Osos. And I wonder, my question is, if he were not willing to barter, would you even be looking at this property that's smack in the middle of a totally residential neighborhood and would change the character of a residential neighborhood? Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, Rob. My name is Steve Smith. Talk into the mic. Oh. My name is Steve Smith, and I've lived on Andre since 1975. I have a lot of concerns about this proposed site. The proposed well site at 2030 Andre should not be a consideration for a municipal well. This is a quiet residential area with lots zoned RA. A municipal well doesn't fall under either one of these zones. The disruption to this neighborhood through the construction and the maintenance and monitoring of this well 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for as long as the well is in operation, is not acceptable. This well will have detrimental impact on all of our existing residential wells. Most of our wells that are still active in the area, with the ones that have failed recently, were in the 100-foot range and less. Most of the existing wells neighboring that site are around the 150 to 200-foot depth. And it's my understanding that you're going to be tapping that particular zone. So I believe it will definitely have an impact on our existing wells. The structure that houses the well and associated equipment, the utilities that will be brought to the site, will be disruptive and unsightly. It is also my understanding that a Southern California developer purchased this property to speculate on this proposed well and stands to retain 10% of the well's production for his personal gain. This in itself is wrong and possibly illegal. I would like that question answered. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Lindy Owen from Los Osos. I had a number of questions. One, how deep has the aquifer gotten over the years? Some 30 years, I believe, of septic discharge, which now for the last year and a half has been completely cut off. That could have something to do with the upper aquifer levels that are causing some people to have to deepen their wells. It's something we need to know because we will have not one drop coming from leach fields. Well, those are the people that don't have to pay outside the prohibition zone. But the largest part of the water that was going into the upper aquifer will no longer be going in. And that was septic discharge, not rain. I'd like to know if you know what zone every single one of the private wells in this area is tapped into. It sounds like at 100 feet, 125, 80 feet, it is the upper aquifer. And I think until you have that information, you can't come up with a good solution of how to have a long-term water supply that doesn't hurt other people. You mentioned that you don't have records of recent wells. That is totally unacceptable in that we were told that all new wells would be monitored for usage. You cannot balance a basin if you have 500 John Doe wells pumping unknown amounts of water out of unknown zones in that aquifer. That's the way it is. Sorry. Would diverting some of the recycled water, which we don't know if it's working on Broderson, we really have no idea. That could be eventually going into a saltwater intruded lower zone, and will be years before we actually know. Would putting recycled water directly into the creekside disposal idea that has been talked about, would that help guarantee that the upper aquifer maintains some kind of sustainable level? And really, lastly, I think you need to explain to people a little bit about the salt water coming into the lower zone. I thought the wells were to be pumped, the inland wells were to be pumped into the lower zones so that we can suck the water out of there instead of out of the front, which isn't a long-term solution either. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Hi, I'm Karen Worcester. I live at 1605 Freeman Lane, also in the Andre Well area. And I have similar concerns to those expressed today. I have just retired from a career in water quality monitoring, and I think one of the things I'm particularly worried about is the lack of information about what our water levels have been doing over the past decade. About 10 years ago, several of my neighbors came to me and said, we really ought to start a level monitoring program because we think our levels are dropping, and I'm really sorry we didn't take that action at that time. Since then, I've heard more than one anecdotal report, and then several here today, of people's wells already in a seemingly long-term decline. And of course, we've been in a drought, yes, but we've had people needing to redrill wells, et cetera. So I'd hate to see our area, our community, ending up like Paso Robles, where the rural residential folks are really being outpaced by water extraction by the vineyards and are losing their capacity to dig wells deep enough to meet their supplies. So please keep that in mind as you move forward. And again, I think data is critical, monitoring data, and if you could make sure to come up with any that's available to you for our area, we'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name's Larry Bender. Live on Andre. Question about balancing water and growth for Los Osos, which I think are two different things. We're putting this well in to balance our water supply, but what about the growth in Los Osos, and where's that water going to come from? And just also, I'm just opposed to the Andre site. I don't think it's a good choice for our town. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody else? Last chance. Okay, seeing none, we'll close public comment. Rob, bring it back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to commend the community for being extremely helpful and tactful in all of their comments, and that's what I've seen in the other meetings I've participated in. It makes it much easier for technical staff to be in this position. Thank you. I hope to cover all the questions, but I will make myself available afterwards if folks want to have one-on-one discussions. One of the questions that I think went through a few comments was why this well is needed. So the basin plan, which is published to our website, if you go to slowcountywater.org and go to the bottom right-hand corner, you can go to the Los Osos Basin Management Plan web link, and you can actually read the basin plan, which describes the methods of balancing the basin. And in essence, we found that our old way of doing business, which was to drill in the most productive portions of this basin towards the west side of the community, like the library well that's sitting right out here, that was very short-sighted and resulted in seawater intrusion, even though the production was great when it first got turned on. And that in order to have this basin not be continually impacted by seawater, we have to back off of pumping on the west side and pump more strategically on the east side. And in fact, the activities over the last few years where we've been shifting our practices have already helped the basin partially recover. We're seeing a drop in some of the chloride levels. Too early to celebrate that, really, but it's certainly encouraging that there are some positives there.
And Rob, you may want to put that cross-section up that goes all the way from the
Yeah.
sand spit as you talk about some of the other plants as well.
Yeah, well, let's just get that up there. It's that one.
Yeah. So sand spit on the left, Los Osos Creek where the yellow is.
Yeah. So you can see that essentially we have some great productive zones to the west, but if we pump from there, we will encourage additional seawater intrusion. And there was some confusion over to how many sites we were actually looking at. So just to be clear, we have 4 sites in this presentation, not exhaustive, but these are our 4 primary sites. And we're looking to screen those down to 1 or 2 well sites. I believe it will be 1, and we will not know that for sure until a technical study that's going to be published here in the next 2 months, until that's published. But I believe we'll be looking for 1 of those 4 sites. So when we say expansion well number 1, that well's already in the ground at the Los Olivos site that the Golden State did, already done. Expansion well number 2 is what we're talking about here, if you're looking at the basin plan and getting the language correct. There was a question as to whether this well could really be 600 feet deep. I was just looking at the geologic cross-section and assuming we went all the way down to the bottom of Zone E. It might be 500 feet, but it's not 300 feet. It'd be a deeper well at the Andre site. The others, not so deep. And there's a staff note that if you haven't seen it, it's published to the website where I went into a little bit more detail on some of this. And I'll publish this presentation as well.
Rob, you might also want to clarify what aquifer the well is going to be pumping from.
I will.
I know the question came up later, but right now it seems like an appropriate time.
I think it is. If you look at Site C there, you'll notice that, you'd have to kind of scale it off, but Zone C really lasts between 150 and 200 feet. You're still in Zone C there. When you're looking at Site C, it goes quite deep. So if your well is less than 200 feet deep from the ground surface, it's pretty likely you're in Zone C. And we would not know until we actually looked at your log, which we're happy to do if you want us to. But if you want to get down into D and E, you're going to be below that 200-foot level.
And a well can produce from a lower zone and not take any water from an upper zone.
Right, and there's some questions about that too. So if we drill down into the lower zones, what will the effect be on the upper zones? The only way to be sure on that is to actually physically test it. We did it at the Sage site, and the water levels did respond in some of the shallow wells. It was a small response. I don't remember the exact number, 3-4 feet, something like that. And some of them had no effect. But regardless, you'd have to test and confirm that in order to be sure of it. I know it's frustrating that maybe if you just write me notes, I can continue to talk from them. But once the chair closes public comments, we usually don't go back and forth, though I will make myself available afterwards. And in the workshop setting, we're going to go back and forth. We're going to vet these things in July. So the ultimate answer to that is one of having to have actual test data that shows it. But it certainly is possible to have two wells right next to each other. We have this in one of our other locations there on 8th Street, drill right next to each other. One's in the deep zone, one's in the shallow zone, and the two don't communicate. But I can't say that emphatically. And Mark, did you want to?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on this point, just because it's important. The basic well construction, you would blank off. You would put unperforated sections of the casing in areas where you didn't want to produce water. So I would think in Zone C, that would be a blank section. You would perforate the target sections, which would be D and C. So that's one way to do it. Like, as you mentioned, there's a lot that goes into this well drilling and production. You really don't. There could be some leakage and some influence, but overall, you do have a mechanical way of blocking off a certain zone and preventing production from that zone.
Yeah. There was a question about the 10% set aside, and I did address that in my staff note. So the final terms of any seller arrangement are not known until there's an agreement. But at that particular Site C, and other sites might have this too, but certainly at Site C, the owner has asked to reserve 10% for future uses. And presumably that would be for development. So we'd only be able to produce 90% of what that well can otherwise provide. And this can be a little bit confusing. So if you look at Site A, and we do the best we can, we may only be able to get 100 acre-feet out of Site A if the conditions are good. Whereas Site C, even if we only pump 90%, we still might be able to get more than the 100. So, but I didn't want to answer that question. And there was a question as to whether this is already decided. I think it's the very nature of environmental law in California that says, nope, you're going to go through a process before you make a decision. That's why even if the CSD wanted to purchase the property, they have to do environmental review first before they're even legally able to purchase it. There was a discussion as to whether that 10% set-aside was legal or not. I think we can dive into that a little more if that site ends up floating to the top of the list, to the legalities of that. We believe, from what we've talked to council about, we think it is legal, but we can certainly vet that, what was meant by that, and make sure we're on the same page there. There was a question as to which water zones or how the water recharges the aquifer. The primary means of recharging the Zone C, the upper aquifer, is rainfall that percolates into the ground, and also the creek there. The basin plan has these wonderfully complicated flow charts that identify how the water goes in, how the water comes out for each of these zones, which if you stare at them for a long time, you can actually make sense of them. They're quite good. The deeper zones, zones D and E, are recharged by slow percolation through, a square mile of Zone C through that thick clay. It doesn't happen in spot locations. It happens over the surface of the whole clay layer, which is fairly continuous across the community. And also Los Osos Creek also has some direct connection with that deep aquifer. The aquifer sediments come right up into the creek. So as the creek flows, it goes right into zones D and E. You can see that here in that yellow alluvium there. You can see that it's in communication with Zone D. That green zone comes right up into that alluvium. So when the creek flows, particularly south of Los Osos Valley Road, that zone is recharged. But the creek also recharges Zone C. You can see that communication to both C and D through the creek. I'm going to bounce around it a little bit here because Lindy asked, well, if you put more water in the creek, will that help to ensure water levels don't drop? I mean, ultimately the answer is sure, that could help. It could prop water levels up. Ultimately, you only have so much recycled water to go around, which is one of the things that this committee is talking about. And so the prioritization of that water, I think, is important. But I think it is a true statement to say the more water is in the creek, the more water levels in that immediate vicinity are raised. Let's see here. Bear with me for a second while I go through my list. Oh, there was a question about if a developer hadn't purchased 2030 Andre, would you be looking at similar properties? We did a mailer to the larger properties. We probably would not have looked at the 1 acre pieces had we not had that discussion with that particular seller. I think now that we know the aquifer characteristics in that area, if everyone was supportive of this and said, oh, I'd like a well on my property, I think the district would consider any viable property in that whole area. But the first look at potential well sites, we did just look at the larger sites because they're easier to develop in general for wells. There was some statements about needing more information about well construction in that area. And I think the process would be through the county health department looking at all the well logs in the more recent wells, and that can be done. We will do that as we move forward. We'll get all the logs that are available to us. We'll show them on a map, identify what aquifer zones we're in before we do environmental review on this, so we can be able to say, here's all the information we have, and be able to definitively tell each well log owner what aquifer zone they are in. So we will do that as this moves forward. There's some questions about how water levels have changed over time. Our annual reports are intended to do that, and we actually plot what we call water level contours. So every year we can look back at previous years and see how things have changed. For this meeting, I didn't go back and look at our first annual report to see how it's changed since the sewer project went into place. I don't think it's major, but we can do that, and that's for you, Lindy. And I think I've described why we need to shift to the east. Level monitoring, I think it was Carol who mentioned that. If you do have an interest in having your level monitored, I think the county has a program where they're willing to do that under certain circumstances. We actually depend on private owners who are willing to have their wells monitored to plot some of these contours and to do our reporting. That's very important. So if your well is not monitored and you want it to be monitored, I think we could talk to the county and get that done for you.
Yeah, Robin, I just wanted to add to that. That's a county function. That's not a function of our committee, or the CSD or whoever. So the well monitoring is totally a county. So I think Carolyn would be the person to talk to.
Yeah, I think so too. Thank you. And then there was some discussion about growth. You know, the basin plan identifies, this is all of this discussion about a new well is focused on what we call Program C. And the initial goal of that program is to balance our basin under current development. Once that does occur and the basin is in balance and the Coastal Commission has received that, what they call substantial evidence that this has actually happened, then I think they will allow, as I think Supervisor Gibson had mentioned, some growth, and you might have a few comments on that. And I think if I didn't do justice to your question, feel free to write that down for me, or we can get it on the side. But Bruce, you want to make a few comments?
Yeah, if I could, let me start with reiterating some of the things I said about process, and I want the public to know that the process ahead on deciding where to drill this well, wherever it ends up, has at least 3 layers of protection and access for you to have the concerns that you raised addressed. And it goes like this. First of all, the environmental analysis, whether it's an environmental impact report or some other document that's created under CEQA, the California Environmental Quality Act. It starts with looking at all the possible impacts of this project, and water levels or effects on neighboring water supplies are number one, but noise and traffic and aesthetics and a variety of other things are typically studied in those, and that what gets studied is subject to a public process. So know that your concerns will be on the record and documented as to, with, as we say, substantial evidence in the record, the impacts of this project will be described. The idea of doing that is to make sure the project, whatever it is, wherever it is configured to mitigate those impacts to a level of less than significant. And there are measures of that, exactly what that means for each of the things like traffic and noise and the rest of that. It goes then to the land use permitting process, which is the coastal development permit, or it's the discretionary action that was described in the start here of the county of the county process to issue a permit. And when we do that, the essence of land use permitting is that whatever is allowed to occur on a certain parcel to the benefit of a public agency or a private landowner cannot compromise the health, safety, and welfare of the rest of the properties that might be affected. And we take that very seriously. And so using the CEQA information, we take a very careful look at decisions that are made on land use so that those impacts are driven down so that they are not significant to neighboring properties. Within that process is a series of appeals. And typically this would be heard by our county planning commission. There would be an appeal path to the Board of Supervisors and an appeal path to the Coastal Commission. So there's plenty of opportunity to have specific issues looked at. And again, those issues get looked at against evidence, against technical expert evidence as to what's going to happen. So I heard a commenter suggest that a well being drilled would lower an upper aquifer level and kill native oak trees. That can't be allowed to happen. And so however the project is configured, wherever it is, there would be technical information and an adaptive management plan to be sure that that didn't happen, and at the same time try to achieve the goals of the process. And then overlaying all of this is the goal of the basin management plan, which is to provide a sustainable water supply for everyone who takes water from the Los Osos groundwater basin. So this being part of that basin management plan, we can't put in a well, whatever agency is responsible, that's going to damage someone else's ability to draw a sustainable supply of water. It's just completely, that result would be completely contrary to the intent of why the 5 of us are sitting here. So I want you to have assurance that that's the case. Then looking forward to growth, you know that Los Osos has been under a moratorium for a very long time, largely because of the sewer system issues. That covers about 85% of the community. There has been a little bit of growth on a parcel-by-parcel basis happening outside of what we call the prohibition zone. All of that growth has had in its own way to address the water supply. But that's this community plan. The question of what happens next, what's the potential for further growth in Los Osos, is the focus of this community plan that's now under preparation at the county level, that goes itself through a whole county process, that eventually goes to the Coastal Commission for their approval. And what we are planning, what it appears that we can do, is right now the Los Osos area is between 15 and 16,000 population. The community plan envisions that the build-out of existing parcels within the town might end up in a population that's in the area of 19,000, maybe a little over 19,000 individuals. And you drive around town, you know the vacant lots, and you know there are places where subdivisions have already been approved and potentially could be in the future. In order to realize that growth, the county is going to have to demonstrate that there's a water supply to serve that growth. And in fact, the basin management plan contains a section that goes beyond balancing the water basin for existing development and talks about what would have to be done in order to serve the expected build-out of 19,000-ish population. That requires other things to be done. And again, a principle there that might be popping into your mind is who pays for these other things? The new development would be paying for the other things. So that's the basic principle of new development paying its way. So where we are right now is in a very interesting place. I think it is a very exciting time, a very potentially a great benefit to this community to come out of the moratorium that has constrained this community for a very long time and look at figuring out how to move forward to make this an even more interesting place than it already is. The Basin Management Committee has its role in the technical studies of the water supply, and it's sort of my job within this committee, because the county's not a water purveyor. It's my job to sort of be an interface between those who supply water and the entity that makes decisions on growth in this unincorporated community. So again, I want you to know that there is a lot of process. It looks complicated from the outside. It has a very rational basis, and it is exactly to take care of issues that you have raised. This question of the 10% set aside for a particular property owner, that might be a form of compensation that such a property owner thinks would be of benefit. But I can tell you that existing development now within the urban area of Los Osos is required to be connected to a municipal water supply, one of the three water purveyors that sit to my right here. So whatever water retention, there's a concept, this property owner chooses to engage in, any development that's going to occur in this part of town is going to require a hookup to a water purveyor, and that is going to be subject to the basin management plan. So we're protected there. Any development beyond that would have to go through its own very extensive process to show that it could provide water, that it could get through the permit process, that it wouldn't negatively affect everybody else's interest. And so I just want you to know that there's a very thorough system of, call it checks and balances, but more a very rigorous pathway that any new development is going to have to carry on when we go through and look at that. So know that the county has a permanent seat on the Basin Management Committee for that very reason. I appreciate my ability to work with my colleagues at the water purveyors to secure the water supply for Los Osos. And Mr. Miller was being very cautious in talking about the changes to seawater intrusion. I'm getting fairly excited. We're starting to see numbers that are definitely moving in the right direction. I won't contradict him and start to declare victory at this point. But boy, I like where the numbers are going, and it shows that the technical that our technical analysis of this basin seems to be right. Yeah, we'll need some more data to confirm this, but we're definitely headed in the right direction on this.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mark?
Just wanted to make a comment on the next steps. You mentioned technical studies continuing to take place, and will that come back to as an agenda item on our? Will we have future presentations on the process and how we're moving forward?
Oh, I'm sure. Workshop is the next step.
Workshop.
If folks didn't feel like they were able to get enough back and forth, we're going to do a workshop, and And then when we come back with more information, well logs, additional data, then we'll bring that back in front of this group and notice folks. We haven't set a date for the workshop yet. When we do,
we're going to set that at our July meeting of the CSD.
The July meeting of the CSD, which is the first Thursday in
right, which
July.
I believe is July 5th, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. So they'll set that date at that time.
Okay.
Bill? Okay, I appreciate the presentation, Rob. I thought it was very, very thorough, and I appreciate the public involvement and comments. Guess it's time to go. But anyways, as Rob mentioned, we're very, very early in the process, and we appreciate all the public comments and input. So Rob's available. I'm available. A lot of you have my email address. I know that. And you can contact the CSD if you want to get in touch with me.
Do you want to do general public comment, Mr. Chair? It is on your agenda.
That's...
Yeah.
Yeah, we will. I just was closing this item. Okay, so now we have public comment for items that were not on the agenda or items we did not discuss. So if you have some items that you'd like to bring up.
Lindy Owen, this is borderline. It was discussed, but it wasn't explained. I just heard that Golden State, that nobody within the prohibition zone or within the water municipal water district is allowed to build anything new. As far as I know, Golden State is issuing will serves.
Yes.
So that's not true. What was said was not true, unless you can explain how Golden State is serving new development in the municipal water district. Currently, there are new wells going in. They're under the jurisdiction of the county. We were promised that they would all be monitored. Every new well would be monitored. If you don't have that data, you're missing some important data that we're trying to get to know how much water those wells are using. It is their right to use every drop they want. But if you don't know how much they're using, then we don't know how much is in the basin. It's not rocket science. And secondly, the county is in control of all the private wells. I just heard that Mr. Gibson was a mediator, not a participant. But the county has 500 private wells. As I understand, maybe that's the wells that are within the prohibition zone. And I just do want to remind people that we had what is estimated to be 500,000 gallons a day going into the upper aquifer, and it's been doing that for 25 years, I believe. A year and a half ago, not one drop goes into those anymore from everybody in the prohibition zone. So losing 500,000 gallons a day into an upper aquifer is significant, and it is recordable. We've had no rain. Creek discharge, you talked about how if the water was to go there, it would. We're pumping it up to Broderson, very expensive. We pay a lot of money to maintain a site up there. We don't know where that water's going. If it were looked at, and we've talked about the possibility of the creek entry zone, if that water were put there, it's a short distance, low electrical, and it has some potential to take care of the upper aquifer if you're going to be pumping more out of it. Those are just my comments.
Thank you.
Just a quick request. The last mailer that I received, only the people that were on the last petition were notified. Could I request that everybody on kind of my neighborhood, which is Andre, Willow, Napomo, Sage, Hollister, and Freeman, plus the people between us and the cemetery, are given notice when we have the workshop, and to keep up to speed on all the other publications.
Okay, thank you. Yep, Chuck?
Good afternoon. My name's Chuck Cecine. I'm speaking as a resident of Los Osos. The Los Osos Community Services District recently sent a letter to the county regarding the contracts selling reclaimed water from the treatment plant. to agricultural interests in the east side of the basin. And I would like to suggest an agenda item in the future to discuss that letter and possible support for that letter that went to the county. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? Okay. Seeing none, then we'll adjourn till our next, well, actually, we'll adjourn, but the next meeting will be the community workshop. And then, do you just want to say one more thing about tomorrow's meeting? Or do you,
Yeah,
Rob?
no, we covered that tomorrow.
Yeah.
Tomorrow there is a conservation workshop.
Come
so-
on out and support us
Right.
at 7 p.m.
Thank you.